The morning mist hung heavy over the castle walls as Captain Marcus Blackwood made his rounds through the ancient corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace. His boots echoed against the cold stone floors, a rhythmic reminder of the discipline that had carried him through 15 years of loyal service to the crown. At 35, Marcus had seen 3 different monarchs occupy the throne, but none had faced the challenges that now threatened to tear the kingdom apart. The current king, Edward III, had been on the throne for only 2 years since his father's unexpected death. What should have been a smooth transition had instead become a powder keg of political tension. The young king, barely 28 years old, found himself caught between the old guard of nobles who had served his father and a new faction of ambitious courtiers who saw opportunity in the chaos of a changing regime. Marcus paused at the great window overlooking the courtyard, where he could see the early morning activities beginning. Servants hurried about their duties, stable boys tended to horses, and merchants prepared their wares for the day's trade. Everything appeared normal, but Marcus had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, especially within the walls of a royal palace. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Lady Catherine Ashworth emerged from the shadows of a side corridor, her emerald silk gown rustling softly as she moved. Lady Catherine was one of the most influential women at court, serving as the Queen's primary advisor and confidant. Her family had been close to the royal family for generations, and her political acumen was renowned throughout the kingdom. "Captain Blackwood," she said, inclining her head slightly in greeting. Her voice carried the cultured tones of nobility, but Marcus detected an underlying tension. "I trust your morning patrol has been uneventful?" Marcus studied her carefully. Lady Catherine rarely made casual conversation, especially not with the captain of the guard. Her presence here, at this early hour, suggested something more pressing than pleasantries. "Indeed, my lady. The palace remains secure. Is there something specific that concerns you?" Lady Catherine glanced around the empty corridor before stepping closer. "There are whispers, Captain. Dangerous whispers that speak of discontent among certain members of the court. I fear there are those who question the king's ability to rule effectively." This was not entirely surprising news to Marcus. He had observed the subtle signs of political maneuvering for weeks now. Private meetings held behind closed doors, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he appeared, and an overall atmosphere of tension that seemed to grow stronger each day. The kingdom faced external threats from neighboring realms, internal economic pressures, and the always-present challenge of maintaining the delicate balance of power among the nobility. "What specific threats have you heard, my lady?" Marcus asked, his voice low and serious. As captain of the guard, his primary responsibility was the physical security of the royal family, but political threats could quickly become physical ones. Lady Catherine hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "There is talk of a formal challenge to the king's legitimacy. Some claim that his ascension to the throne was too hasty, that proper protocols were not followed after his father's death. Others suggest that he lacks the experience and wisdom necessary to lead the kingdom through these troubled times." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. A challenge to royal legitimacy was among the most serious threats a monarchy could face. It had the potential to divide the kingdom, pitting noble house against noble house and potentially leading to civil war. The stability of the entire realm depended on the acceptance of the rightful monarch's authority. "Who leads this opposition?" Marcus inquired, though he suspected he might already know the answer. "Lord Aldrich Vance has been particularly vocal in his criticisms," Lady Catherine replied. "He commands considerable influence among the Eastern lords, and his family's wealth gives him significant political leverage. He has been carefully building alliances, promising various concessions and advantages to those who might support a change in leadership." Lord Aldrich Vance was indeed a formidable opponent. His family controlled vast lands and resources in the eastern provinces, and his political connections extended beyond the kingdom's borders. He was known for his shrewd intellect and ruthless ambition, qualities that had served him well in business and politics, but made him a dangerous adversary to the crown. "What does he propose as an alternative to King Edward's rule?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "He speaks of a regency council," Lady Catherine explained. "A group of experienced nobles who would govern in the king's name until he proves himself capable of independent rule. Of course, Vance would position himself as the primary regent, effectively making him the true ruler of the kingdom." The implications were staggering. A regency would strip King Edward of real power while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. It was a clever political maneuver that could appeal to those who were uncomfortable with open rebellion but dissatisfied with the current state of affairs. More concerning still, it provided a legal framework that could eventually lead to the king's complete removal from power. Marcus and Lady Catherine continued their conversation as they walked through the palace corridors. She explained that the situation was becoming increasingly urgent. Lord Vance had requested a formal audience with the king later that week, ostensibly to discuss matters of state governance. However, intelligence suggested that this meeting was intended to present the king with an ultimatum regarding the establishment of a regency council. The king must be warned, Marcus stated firmly. He needs to understand the full scope of what he's facing. Agreed, Lady Catherine replied, but we must be careful about how we approach this. The king's reaction could determine whether this situation can be resolved diplomatically or whether it will escalate into open conflict. If he responds with anger or appears weak, it could strengthen Vance's position. They discussed various strategies for addressing the threat. The king needed to demonstrate strong leadership while avoiding actions that could be perceived as tyrannical or desperate. He would need to shore up support among loyal nobles, address legitimate grievances that were fueling discontent, and present a clear vision for the kingdom's future. As they talked, other figures began to appear in the corridors. The palace was awakening to another day of complex political maneuvering. Nobles dressed in their finest clothing prepared for court sessions. Servants hurried about their duties, and various officials readied themselves for the business of governance. Each person they encountered could potentially be an ally, an enemy, or someone whose loyalty remained uncertain. Lady Catherine pointed out several individuals as they passed, providing Marcus with crucial intelligence about the current state of court allegiances. Lord Hampton, an elderly noble with extensive military experience, remained firmly loyal to the crown. Lady Blackthorn, whose family controlled important trade routes, seemed to be wavering in her support. Sir Gregory, a younger noble with ambitions of his own, appeared to be keeping his options open. The complexity of these relationships was overwhelming. Each noble family had its own interests, grievances, and aspirations. The art of royal governance involved balancing these competing demands while maintaining overall stability and progress. King Edward's youth and relative inexperience made this balancing act particularly challenging. Marcus realized that his role would need to expand beyond traditional security concerns. The threats facing the kingdom were primarily political in nature, but political conflicts had a tendency to become violent when diplomatic solutions proved elusive. He would need to prepare for various scenarios, from assassination attempts to armed rebellion. They reached the royal quarters, where additional guards maintained constant vigilance. Marcus exchanged brief reports with his subordinates, confirming that the night had passed without incident. However, the conversation with Lady Catherine had revealed that the real threats were not the kind that could be prevented with swords and armor alone. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself observing the court activities with new eyes. Every conversation, every glance, every gesture took on potential significance. The elaborate dance of court etiquette continued as always, but underneath the polished surface, dangerous currents were flowing. The king appeared for his morning activities, and Marcus was struck by how young and uncertain he looked. Edward III possessed the bearing of royalty, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood the precarious nature of his position. Leading a kingdom required more than birthright. It demanded political skill, emotional strength, and the ability to inspire confidence in others. Throughout the day, Marcus gathered additional intelligence about the developing crisis. He spoke with trusted guards, loyal servants, and reliable informants throughout the palace. The picture that emerged was increasingly troubling. Lord Vance's influence was growing, and the timeline for potential action appeared to be accelerating. The evening brought new developments. A messenger arrived from the eastern provinces with news that could shift the entire balance of power. Border conflicts with neighboring kingdoms were intensifying, and there were reports of unusual military movements that suggested potential invasion preparations. This external threat could either unite the kingdom behind their young king or provide additional ammunition for those who questioned his leadership capabilities. As night fell over Raven's Hollow Palace, Marcus prepared for another long vigil. The stakes had never been higher, and the coming days would determine not just the fate of King Edward III, but the future of the entire kingdom. Political intrigue had always been a part of court life, but the current situation threatened to destroy everything that previous generations had built. The ancient stones of the palace had witnessed many struggles for power throughout the centuries. Kings had risen and fallen, dynasties had been established and overthrown, and the kingdom had survived through times of peace and war. But the challenges facing the current monarch seemed particularly daunting, requiring navigation through treacherous political waters while maintaining the strength and stability that the kingdom desperately needed. Marcus understood that his loyalty to the crown meant more than just protecting the king's physical safety. He would need to become a guardian of the monarchy itself, defending not just against assassins and rebels, but against the subtle forces of political manipulation that could prove even more dangerous than any sword or arrow. The great hall of Raven's Hollow Palace buzzed with tension as nobles gathered for the weekly court session. King Edward III sat upon the ancient throne, its carved dragons and golden inlays catching the morning light that streamed through tall, stained-glass windows. Captain Marcus Blackwood stood at attention nearby, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt as he scanned the assembled courtiers for any sign of threat or unusual behavior. 3 days had passed since Lady Catherine's warning about Lord Vance's growing opposition, and the political atmosphere had grown increasingly charged. Marcus had spent those days gathering intelligence, strengthening security measures, and quietly assessing the loyalty of various court members. What he had discovered was deeply troubling. Lord Aldrich Vance entered the hall with his usual commanding presence, his rich purple robes marking his high station among the nobility. He was accompanied by several supporters, including Lord Wessex, whose military connections made him a valuable ally, and Lady Mordaunt, whose family controlled significant financial resources. The group moved with the confidence of people who believed they held the advantage in whatever confrontation was to come. King Edward acknowledged their presence with a slight nod, but Marcus could see the tension in the young monarch's shoulders. The king had been briefed on the developing situation, and while he had received the information with apparent calm, Marcus knew that the pressure was taking its toll. Ruling a kingdom was burden enough without having to constantly watch for treachery among those who were supposed to be loyal supporters. The formal business of court began with routine matters, trade agreements, tax assessments, and minor disputes between noble houses. These mundane affairs provided a veneer of normalcy, but Marcus could feel the undercurrent of anticipation that ran through the assembled nobles. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something more significant to occur. Lady Catherine, resplendent in deep blue silk adorned with silver embroidery, took her place near the throne, as was her right as the Queen's chief advisor. Her presence provided some comfort to Marcus, as he knew she remained firmly loyal to the crown despite the growing pressure from opposition forces. However, he also recognized that her position made her a target for those who sought to undermine royal authority. The turning point came when Lord Vance requested permission to address the court on matters of state governance. This was his right as a high-ranking noble, but the timing and circumstances made his intentions suspect. King Edward granted the request, though Marcus noticed the slight tightening around the monarch's eyes that suggested he understood the significance of what was about to unfold. Lord Vance rose from his seat and moved to the center of the hall with theatrical precision. His voice carried clearly through the large space as he began to speak about his concerns regarding the kingdom's current direction. He spoke eloquently about economic challenges, military threats, and the need for experienced guidance during these difficult times. "Your Majesty," Vance said, his tone respectful but firm, "the kingdom faces unprecedented challenges that require wisdom gained through years of experience. While your dedication to the crown is unquestioned, many of your loyal subjects believe that additional counsel and support would strengthen your rule and ensure the stability of the realm." The words were carefully chosen to avoid any direct challenge to the king's legitimacy. While clearly suggesting that his leadership was inadequate, Marcus watched the faces of the assembled nobles, noting who nodded in agreement, who remained neutral, and who appeared uncomfortable with Vance's implications. King Edward allowed Vance to continue his speech, which gradually became more pointed in its criticism. The Lord spoke of decisions that had been made without sufficient consultation, of opportunities missed due to inexperience, and of the growing concern among the nobility about the kingdom's future under current leadership. "I propose," Vance concluded, "the establishment of a formal advisory council with expanded authority to assist your Majesty in matters of governance. This council would consist of experienced nobles who could provide the wisdom and guidance necessary to navigate these troubled times. The hall fell silent as the implications of this proposal sank in. What Vance was suggesting was essentially a limitation on royal power, a system that would require the king to obtain approval from a council of nobles before making major decisions. It was a significant step toward the regency that Lady Catherine had warned about. King Edward's response would be crucial. Too aggressive a rejection could make him appear tyrannical, while acceptance would effectively surrender much of his authority. Marcus tensed, ready to act if the situation deteriorated into something more dangerous than political maneuvering. "Lord Vance," the king replied, his voice steady despite the pressure he must have been feeling. "I appreciate your concern for the kingdom's welfare. However, the crown has always functioned with the advice and consent of the nobility through established channels. The royal council already provides the consultation you describe." This was a diplomatic rejection, but Vance was clearly prepared for such a response. "Your Majesty, the current council operates at your pleasure and can be dismissed at will. What the kingdom requires is a more formalized structure that ensures continuity and prevents hasty decisions that might prove detrimental to the realm." The debate that followed was conducted with the elaborate courtesy required by court protocol, but the underlying conflict was unmistakable. Other nobles began to voice their opinions, and Marcus could see the court dividing along factional lines. Some supported Vance's proposal, others defended royal prerogative, and many seemed to be waiting to see which side would prove more advantageous to support. Lady Catherine requested permission to speak, and her intervention proved masterful. She acknowledged the legitimate concerns raised by Lord Vance while defending the king's right to govern according to established law and tradition. She pointed out that the proposed council structure would create confusion in times of crisis, when decisive action might be necessary to protect the kingdom. "The strength of our monarchy," she argued, "lies not in limiting royal authority, but in ensuring that the crown receives the best possible advice from loyal and experienced counselors." This has always been achieved through the traditional council structure, which allows for both consultation and decisive leadership. The political chess match continued for over an hour, with various nobles presenting arguments and counterarguments. Marcus found himself impressed by the complexity of the maneuvering involved. Each speaker seemed to have multiple objectives: advancing their own position, supporting their chosen faction, and protecting their family's interests for the future. During a brief recess, Marcus was able to speak privately with several trusted allies. Sir William Harrington, whose family had served the crown for generations, expressed grave concern about the precedent that would be set by accepting Vance's proposal. "If we allow the nobility to dictate terms to the crown now," he said quietly, "where will it end? Today, it's a council with expanded authority. Tomorrow, it might be demands for the king's abdication." This perspective was shared by other traditional loyalists, but Marcus also heard different viewpoints from nobles, who genuinely believed that some form of power sharing might be beneficial for the kingdom. The complexity of these political positions made it difficult to determine who could be trusted and who might change sides if circumstances shifted. When court resumed, King Edward made a carefully calculated response to Lord Vance's proposal. He announced that he would take the matter under consideration and would consult with his existing council about potential reforms to the advisory process. This bought time while avoiding either complete acceptance or outright rejection of the opposition's demands. However, Vance was not satisfied with this compromise. He pressed for a more definitive response, arguing that the kingdom's challenges required immediate action. This more aggressive approach began to reveal his true intentions, and Marcus noticed that some nobles who had initially seemed sympathetic to his cause began to appear uncomfortable with his pushiness. The session ended without resolution, but battle lines had been clearly drawn. As the nobles dispersed, Marcus observed their interactions carefully. He noted which groups formed, who spoke with whom, and where potential alliances might be strengthening or weakening. Later that evening, Marcus met with Lady Catherine and several other trusted advisors to assess the day's developments. The picture they painted was sobering. While King Edward had handled the immediate challenge well, the underlying threat remained serious. Lord Vance had demonstrated significant support among the nobility, and his proposal had exposed genuine concerns about royal leadership that could not be simply dismissed. "We need to address the legitimate grievances that are fueling this opposition," Lady Catherine observed. "Some of the nobles' concerns about consultation and decision-making processes are valid. If we can demonstrate that the king is responsive to reasonable input while maintaining his authority, it might undermine Vance's more extreme proposals." This approach made sense politically, but it also carried risks. Any concessions could be perceived as weakness, potentially encouraging even greater demands in the future. The balance between firmness and flexibility would be crucial in navigating the coming challenges. Marcus learned that evening about additional complications developing in the background. Intelligence reports suggested that Lord Vance had been in communication with representatives from neighboring kingdoms, potentially seeking external support for his political maneuvering. This raised the stakes considerably, as foreign involvement in domestic political disputes could threaten the kingdom's independence. The investigation into these external connections became a priority for Marcus and his security apparatus. They needed to determine whether Vance was simply exploring options or had already made commitments that could compromise the kingdom's sovereignty. The evidence gathered would be crucial in determining how to respond to the growing political crisis. As the night deepened, Marcus reflected on the day's events and the challenges that lay ahead. The political intrigue at court had reached a critical juncture, with the kingdom's future hanging in the balance. The coming days would test not only King Edward's leadership abilities, but also the loyalty and wisdom of all those who served the crown. The ancient walls of Ravenshollow Palace had witnessed many such conflicts throughout history, but each crisis was unique in its particular challenges and potential consequences. Marcus understood that his role in protecting the monarchy had evolved beyond simple security concerns to encompass the broader defense of royal authority and legitimacy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the kingdom would continue under the leadership of King Edward III or whether power would shift to a council dominated by ambitious nobles with their own agenda for the realm's future. The private chambers of King Edward III were illuminated by flickering candlelight as an emergency council convened in the early hours before dawn. Captain Marcus Blackwood had awakened the king with disturbing news that could not wait for the formal morning briefing. Intelligence gathered during the night had revealed the true scope of Lord Vance's conspiracy, and immediate action was required to prevent a potential coup. Marcus stood at attention as he delivered his report to the hastily assembled group, which included Lady Catherine, Sir William Harrington, and Lord Chancellor Benedict Morrison. The king, though clearly shaken by being awakened at such an hour, listened intently as the full extent of the threat became clear. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, his voice grave with the weight of the information he carried, "our surveillance has uncovered evidence that Lord Vance's plans extend far beyond the advisory council proposal he presented in court. He has been secretly meeting with military commanders attempting to secure their support for more drastic action if his political maneuvering fails to achieve his objectives." The king's face grew pale as he absorbed this information. The involvement of military leaders transformed the situation from a political dispute to a potential armed rebellion. The kingdom's stability depended on the loyalty of its armed forces, and any erosion of that loyalty could have catastrophic consequences. Lady Catherine leaned forward in her chair, her expression reflecting both concern and determination. "Which commanders has he approached, and what has been their response?" she asked, understanding that the answers would be crucial in determining how to proceed. Marcus consulted his notes, though the details were already burned into his memory. General Harrison, who commands the Eastern Garrison, appears to have rebuffed Vance's approaches and reported the contact to his immediate superiors. However, Colonel Fitzpatrick, who oversees the Palace Guard detachment, has been more receptive to Vance's suggestions. Additionally, Captain Thornfield of the Royal Navy has agreed to meet with Vance's representatives next week. The implications were staggering. If Vance could secure support from key military leaders, he would have the power to enforce his political demands through force if necessary. The very foundations of royal authority were being challenged not just through political maneuvering but through the potential subversion of the military chain of command. Lord Chancellor Morrison, whose years of experience had taught him to expect the worst from ambitious nobles, shook his head in dismay. "This goes beyond simple opposition to royal policy," he said grimly. "What Vance is planning amounts to treason, and it must be dealt with accordingly." King Edward, who had remained silent while absorbing the gravity of the situation, finally spoke. His voice carried a new steel that had not been evident during the previous day's court session. "What evidence do we have of these approaches to military commanders? We cannot act on suspicion alone, no matter how credible." Marcus had anticipated this question and was prepared with a detailed response. "We have testimony from General Harrison regarding Vance's direct approach to him. Additionally, One of our trusted informants was present during a meeting between Vance and Colonel Fitzpatrick, and we have documented the time and location of their encounters. Physical evidence includes correspondence that was intercepted, though it is written in coded language that requires careful interpretation. The group spent the next hour examining the evidence and discussing possible responses. Each option carried significant risks and potential consequences that needed to be carefully weighed. Acting too aggressively could make the king appear tyrannical and might push neutral nobles into Vance's camp. However, failing to act decisively could allow the conspiracy to grow stronger and potentially succeed in its ultimate objectives. Lady Catherine proposed a multifaceted approach that would address both the immediate threat and the underlying political concerns that were fueling opposition to the king's rule. We need to demonstrate strength while also showing that we are responsive to legitimate grievances, she argued. This means taking action against the treasonous aspects of Vance's conspiracy while simultaneously implementing reforms that address valid concerns about governance. This strategy made sense politically, but implementing it would require careful coordination and precise timing. The king would need to show leadership, while avoiding actions that could be perceived as desperate or vindictive. The balance between justice and mercy would be crucial in maintaining broader support among the nobility. Sir William suggested that they begin by securing the loyalty of key military commanders through personal meetings with the king. If we can ensure that the armed forces remain loyal to the crown, he reasoned, then Vance's conspiracy loses much of its potential power. Political opposition is one thing, but without military support, he cannot hope to overthrow royal authority. Marcus was tasked with arranging these meetings while also strengthening security measures throughout the palace. The discovery of the conspiracy had revealed vulnerabilities in their intelligence network that needed to be addressed immediately. They could no longer assume that traditional protocols would be sufficient to protect the monarchy from internal threats. As dawn broke over the kingdom, messengers were dispatched to summon key military leaders for urgent consultations with the king. The meetings were arranged under the pretext of discussing border security and defense preparations, which provided a legitimate cover for the true purpose of ensuring continued loyalty to the crown. Throughout the morning, King Edward met individually with each commander, personally affirming their loyalty and subtly probing for any signs of wavering support. These conversations revealed valuable intelligence about the scope of Vance's approaches and helped identify which officers could be trusted completely and which might require closer surveillance. General Harrison's meeting with the king proved particularly valuable. The veteran commander provided detailed information about Vance's approach, including specific promises that had been made and threats that had been implied. According to Harrison, Vance had suggested that military leaders who supported his cause would be rewarded with expanded authority and resources, while those who remained loyal to the current regime might find their positions in jeopardy. "Your Majesty," Harrison reported, "Lord Vance spoke as if the change in leadership was inevitable, not merely possible. He seemed confident that he had the support necessary to succeed, which suggests that his conspiracy may be more advanced than we initially believed." This intelligence prompted Marcus to accelerate his investigation into the full scope of the plot. Additional surveillance was deployed, and trusted agents began infiltrating Vance's network to gather more detailed information about his plans and supporters. The picture that emerged was increasingly troubling, revealing a conspiracy that extended beyond political opposition to include detailed preparations for assuming control of the government. Meanwhile, Lady Catherine worked to strengthen political support for the king among nobles who remained uncommitted. She held discreet meetings with influential courtiers, addressing their concerns while emphasizing the importance of stability and legitimate succession. Her efforts were crucial in preventing further defections to Vance's cause. The afternoon brought new developments when a coded message intended for Lord Vance was intercepted by palace intelligence. The message, which appeared to originate from outside the kingdom, contained references to mutual interests and coordinated timing that suggested foreign involvement in the conspiracy. This discovery elevated the threat level significantly, as it implied that Vance's rebellion might be supported or even directed by external enemies. King Edward's response to this revelation demonstrated the growth in his political maturity that had occurred under pressure. Rather than reacting with anger or hasty decisions, he convened a formal strategy session to determine the best course of action. The king's measured response impressed even his critics and began to undermine Vance's narrative about royal inexperience and incompetence. The strategy session produced a comprehensive plan for addressing the conspiracy while maintaining the appearance of normal court operations. Direct action against Lord Vance would be preceded by careful documentation of his treasonous activities and the securing of broad support among loyal nobles. The approach was designed to ensure that when action was taken, it would be seen as necessary and justified, rather than arbitrary or vindictive. Marcus was given responsibility for coordinating the security aspects of the plan, which included enhanced protection for the royal family, surveillance of suspected conspirators, and preparations for potential emergency situations. The scope of these preparations reflected the serious nature of the threat and the understanding that the conspiracy might attempt increasingly desperate measures as it came under pressure. As evening approached, intelligence reports continued to arrive that filled in more details about the conspiracy's structure and timeline. It became clear that Lord Vance had been planning his move for months, carefully building alliances and preparing contingency plans for various scenarios. The sophistication of his preparations suggested that he had significant resources and experienced advisors supporting his efforts. The foreign connection proved to be particularly concerning. Additional intercepted communications suggested that neighboring kingdoms were indeed involved in supporting Vance's conspiracy, potentially hoping to weaken the realm through internal strife, or to install a more compliant ruler who would serve their interests. This external dimension transformed what might have been a domestic political dispute into a matter of national security. King Edward's resolve strengthened as the full scope of the threat became apparent. The young monarch understood that he was not merely defending his personal position but protecting the independence and sovereignty of the entire kingdom. This broader perspective gave him the confidence and determination necessary to take decisive action against the conspiracy. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only who would rule the kingdom, but whether it would remain an independent realm or fall under foreign influence through a puppet regime. The political intrigue had evolved into something far more dangerous and consequential than anyone had initially imagined. As night fell over Ravenshollow Palace, Marcus prepared for what might be the most challenging period of his career as captain of the guard. The coming days would test every aspect of his training and experience as he worked to protect both the king and the kingdom from enemies who operated through deception and manipulation rather than open warfare. The ancient stones of the palace seemed to echo with the weight of history, reminding all within that the current crisis was part of a long tradition of struggles for power and legitimacy that had shaped the kingdom throughout the centuries. The outcome of this particular conflict would determine whether that tradition would continue or whether a new and potentially darker chapter in the realm's history was about to begin. The tension in the royal war room was palpable, as King Edward III studied the detailed maps spread across the ancient oak table. The intelligence gathered over the past week had revealed the shocking scope of Lord Vance's conspiracy, and the time for decisive action had finally arrived. Captain Marcus Blackwood stood ready to execute the carefully planned operation that would either save the kingdom or plunge it into civil war. The evidence against Lord Vance had grown overwhelming. Intercepted communications revealed not only his attempts to subvert military commanders, but also his coordination with foreign agents who sought to destabilize the kingdom. Most damning of all was the discovery of a detailed timeline for a planned coup that was scheduled to begin within days, coinciding with the king's planned visit to the eastern provinces. Lady Catherine had spent sleepless nights coordinating with loyal nobles to ensure adequate support for the king's actions. Her efforts had been crucial in building a coalition that would legitimize the crown's response to the conspiracy. Without this political backing, any move against Lord Vance could have been portrayed as tyrannical overreach rather than necessary defense of the realm. The arrest warrants have been prepared, announced Lord Chancellor Morrison, his weathered hands holding the documents that would formally accuse Lord Vance and his co-conspirators of high treason. However, executing these warrants will require careful timing and coordination. We cannot afford to allow any of the conspirators to escape or to rally their supporters. Marcus had spent days planning the simultaneous operations that would be necessary to apprehend all the major conspirators before they could react to each other's capture. The logistics were complicated by the fact that the suspects were scattered across different locations, some within the palace itself and others in various parts of the kingdom. Coordination with loyal military units would be essential to ensure success. King Edward, who had matured considerably under the pressure of recent events, demonstrated his growth by personally reviewing every aspect of the operation. His questions were sharp and insightful, revealing a strategic mind that was learning to think several moves ahead of his opponents. The young monarch was transforming from an uncertain ruler into a decisive leader capable of protecting his throne and kingdom. What contingencies have we prepared if Lord Vance attempts to resist arrest or flee the kingdom? The king inquired, his voice steady despite the enormous pressure he was under. The question demonstrated his understanding that their opponents would not surrender quietly and might attempt desperate measures to avoid capture. Marcus had indeed prepared for such possibilities. We have positioned loyal troops at all major routes leading from the palace and the capital city. Additionally, our naval allies have agreed to patrol the coastline to prevent escape by sea. Lord Vance's properties have been quietly surrounded, though from a distance that will not alert him to our preparations. The plan called for simultaneous raids at dawn, when most of the conspirators would be at their residences and less likely to have assembled their supporters. The element of surprise was crucial, as it would prevent the conspiracy from activating whatever contingency plans they might have developed for such a situation. Lady Catherine had also prepared a comprehensive communication strategy to ensure that the kingdom's population understood the necessity and legitimacy of the king's actions. Messengers were ready to carry proclamations to every major town and city, explaining the discovery of the treasonous conspiracy and the evidence that had necessitated the arrests. Public perception would be crucial in determining whether the operation strengthened or weakened royal authority. As the final preparations were completed, Marcus received disturbing intelligence from one of his most trusted agents. The spy had discovered that Lord Vance was planning to accelerate his timeline, with the coup now scheduled to begin the following night rather than waiting for the king's departure. This development meant that their window for action had narrowed dramatically, and they would need to move immediately to prevent the conspiracy from striking first. "Your Majesty," Marcus reported urgently, "our intelligence indicates that Lord Vance intends to act tomorrow evening. We cannot wait for our originally planned timing. The arrests must begin at dawn today, or we risk allowing the conspiracy to preempt our actions." King Edward's response demonstrated the leadership qualities that had been forged under pressure. Without hesitation, he authorized the immediate implementation of their plan, understanding that delay could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. His decisive action impressed even the most experienced advisors, who had watched him grow from an uncertain young monarch into a confident leader. The pre-dawn hours brought a flurry of coordinated activity as loyal guards and soldiers moved into position throughout the kingdom. Marcus personally led the team responsible for apprehending Lord Vance, understanding that the success or failure of this particular arrest could determine the outcome of the entire operation. The approach to Lord Vance's residence required extreme caution, as intelligence suggested that he might have hired mercenaries to provide additional security. The building was surrounded gradually by teams moving through the early morning darkness, their movements coordinated to ensure that no escape routes remained available. When the moment for action arrived, Marcus led his men through the main entrance while other teams secured the rear and side exits. The operation was conducted with military precision, though the guards were prepared for potential resistance from Vance's supporters, who might be willing to fight rather than surrender. Lord Vance's capture proved surprisingly anticlimactic. The ambitious noble was found in his study, apparently having spent the night reviewing documents related to his conspiracy. His calm demeanor suggested that he had been expecting arrest and had prepared himself mentally for this outcome. However, his composed exterior could not hide the calculating mind that continued to search for opportunities even in defeat. "Captain Blackwood," Vance said as the arrest was carried out, his voice maintaining the aristocratic dignity that had served him well throughout his political career. "I trust that His Majesty will allow me the courtesy of a proper trial before the assembled nobility. After all, the charges against me are quite serious, and they deserve thorough examination." This request was both predictable and concerning. Vance clearly intended to use any trial as an opportunity to present his case against the king's rule and to rally support among nobles who might be sympathetic to his arguments. The legal proceedings would become another battlefield in the struggle for political legitimacy and popular support. Meanwhile, the other arrest operations were proceeding across the kingdom with varying degrees of success. Colonel Fitzpatrick, the military officer who had been most receptive to Vance's approaches, was apprehended without incident at his quarters. However, 2 other conspirators had apparently received advance warning and had fled their residences before the arrest teams arrived. The escape of these conspirators created new complications. as they might attempt to rally military units that remained loyal to their cause, or seek refuge with foreign supporters who could provide protection in exchange for intelligence about the kingdom's defenses and political situation. Marcus immediately dispatched pursuit teams while also alerting border guards to watch for suspicious travelers. As news of the arrests spread throughout the palace and the capital city, the reaction was mixed. Loyal supporters of the crown expressed relief that the threat had been neutralized, while others questioned whether the king had acted too hastily or heavy-handedly. The political battle was far from over. Even though the immediate military threat had been addressed, Lady Catherine's communication strategy proved crucial in shaping public perception of the events. The proclamations explaining the discovery of the conspiracy and the evidence of foreign involvement helped convince many wavering nobles that the king's actions had been necessary for the protection of the realm. However, some continued to question whether alternative approaches might have been more appropriate. The interrogation of captured conspirators revealed additional disturbing details about the scope of the plot. Foreign gold had indeed been used to finance the conspiracy, and plans had been developed for installing a puppet government that would serve the interests of neighboring kingdoms rather than protecting the independence of the realm. These revelations helped justify the king's actions and undermined sympathy for the arrested conspirators. King Edward's personal involvement in reviewing the evidence and making key decisions during the crisis had demonstrated leadership qualities that impressed even former critics. His transformation from an uncertain young monarch to a decisive ruler capable of protecting the kingdom had been remarkable, and it strengthened his position for future challenges. However, the immediate crisis had also revealed vulnerabilities in the kingdom's political and security systems that would need to be addressed. The fact that such an extensive conspiracy could develop without earlier detection suggested that reforms would be necessary to prevent similar threats in the future. Marcus found himself reflecting on the lessons learned during this crisis as he prepared reports on the operation's success and areas for improvement. The captain of the guard had been forced to expand his role far beyond traditional security concerns, becoming involved in intelligence gathering, political analysis, and strategic planning. These expanded responsibilities would likely continue as the kingdom adapted to new realities. The foreign dimension of the conspiracy had been particularly troubling, as it suggested that neighboring kingdoms viewed the realm as vulnerable to internal manipulation. Strengthening defenses against such interference would require not only better intelligence capabilities, but also more sophisticated diplomatic and political strategies. As the day progressed, additional evidence continued to emerge that filled in more details about the conspiracy's organization and objectives. The sophistication of the planning and the extent of foreign support suggested that this had been a serious threat to the kingdom's independence, justifying the decisive action that had been taken. The successful operation had strengthened King Edward's position considerably, but it had also created new challenges and responsibilities. The young monarch would need to follow up his decisive action with effective governance that addressed the legitimate concerns that had made some nobles receptive to Vance's arguments in the first place. The political landscape of the kingdom had been fundamentally altered by recent events, with new alliances forming and old assumptions being challenged. The coming months would test whether the lessons learned during this crisis could be applied to create a stronger and more stable foundation for royal authority and national independence. The grand courtroom of Ravenshollow Palace had been transformed into an arena where the very future of the kingdom would be decided. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic arrests of Lord Vance and his co-conspirators, and the time had come for their trial before a tribunal of noble peers. Captain Marcus Blackwood maintained his vigilant watch as the proceedings began, knowing that this legal confrontation would be every bit as dangerous as the political conspiracy that had preceded it. King Edward III presided over the tribunal from his ceremonial throne, flanked by the kingdom's most respected judges and legal scholars. The young monarch had insisted on a completely transparent trial, understanding that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. His decision to allow the proceedings to be witnessed by representatives from across the kingdom demonstrated his confidence in the evidence and his commitment to legitimate governance. Lord Aldrich Vance entered the courtroom with his characteristic dignity intact, despite the heavy chains that symbolized his fall from grace. His bearing remained aristocratic, and his eyes showed the sharp intelligence that had made him such a formidable political opponent. Even in defeat, he commanded attention and respect, making him a dangerous adversary in the legal battle that was about to unfold. The charges against Vance were read aloud by the court herald, each accusation carrying the weight of potential death. High treason, conspiracy against the crown, correspondence with foreign enemies, and attempted subversion of the military were crimes that traditionally carried the ultimate penalty. However, Vance's noble birth entitled him to trial by his peers rather than summary execution, creating an opportunity for him to present his defense. Lady Catherine sat in the section reserved for court advisors, her presence serving as both a show of support for the crown and a reminder of the political complexities involved in the case. Her influence among the nobility would be crucial in ensuring that the trial's outcome was accepted as legitimate rather than dismissed as royal vengeance against political opposition. The prosecution's case was presented by Sir Edmund Whitfield, the kingdom's most experienced legal advocate. His methodical presentation of evidence painted a devastating picture of Vance's conspiracy, beginning with the initial attempts to undermine royal authority and escalating to coordination with foreign agents and plans for armed rebellion. Marcus had worked closely with the prosecution team to ensure that all evidence was properly documented and presented. The captain's testimony regarding the surveillance operations and the discovery of incriminating communications was particularly compelling, as his reputation for honesty and loyalty to the crown lent credibility to even the most damaging revelations. The intercepted correspondence proved to be the most damaging evidence against Vance. The coded messages revealed not only his treasonous intentions, but also the extent of foreign support for his conspiracy. When decoded and presented to the court, these documents showed that neighboring kingdoms had promised military assistance and financial support in exchange for future concessions that would compromise the realm's independence. However, Vance's defense proved more sophisticated than many had expected. His attorney, Master Geoffrey Hartwell, one of the kingdom's most skilled legal minds, challenged both the methods used to gather evidence and the interpretation of the documents presented. His arguments were designed to raise doubts about the severity of Vance's crimes while portraying him as a patriotic noble whose concerns about royal governance had been misunderstood and exaggerated. The defense strategy centered on the argument that Vance's actions had been motivated by legitimate concerns about the kingdom's welfare rather than personal ambition or treasonous intent. Hartwell argued that correspondence with foreign representatives was a normal part of diplomatic relations, and that discussions about alternative governance structures were within the rights of concerned nobility. This approach was legally clever but politically dangerous. By defending Vance's right to question royal authority and seek foreign consultation, the defense was essentially arguing for a broader interpretation of noble privileges that could undermine the monarchy's authority in the future. King Edward recognized these implications and understood that the trial's outcome would set important precedents for royal power. The testimony of military officers who had been approached by Vance proved crucial in establishing the conspiracy's scope and intent. General Harrison's detailed account of Vance's recruitment efforts demonstrated that the conspiracy had moved far beyond political discussion to active preparation for armed rebellion. The general's credibility and his obvious reluctance to testify against a fellow nobleman made his testimony particularly powerful. Colonel Fitzpatrick's testimony provided even more damaging evidence, though his cooperation with the prosecution was clearly motivated by his desire to receive lenient treatment for his own involvement in the conspiracy. His detailed knowledge of the planned coup's timeline and objectives revealed the sophistication of Vance's planning and the serious threat it had posed to the kingdom's stability. The foreign agent who had been captured during the investigation provided testimony that shocked even hardened observers of court politics. Under oath, he revealed that neighboring kingdoms had indeed promised substantial support for Vance's rebellion, including troops and financial resources that would have made resistance to royal authority much more feasible than anyone had imagined. This testimony effectively destroyed any remaining argument that Vance's actions had been motivated by patriotic concern rather than treasonous ambition. The evidence of foreign involvement transformed the case from a domestic political dispute into a clear matter of national security, making the charges of treason much more difficult to dispute. Vance's personal testimony proved to be the climax of the trial. The former lord maintained his dignity and intelligence throughout his examination, presenting himself as a misunderstood patriot whose only crime had been excessive zeal in seeking to protect the kingdom from incompetent leadership. His performance was masterful, combining aristocratic bearing with carefully crafted arguments that portrayed his actions in the most favorable possible light. However, Under cross-examination, Vance's testimony revealed the calculating ambition that had motivated his conspiracy. When pressed about specific details of his communications with foreign agents and his plans for assuming power, his responses showed a level of preparation and coordination that contradicted his claims of simply expressing legitimate concerns about governance. The turning point came when the prosecution presented evidence of Vance's personal financial arrangements with foreign supporters. Documents showed that he had received substantial payments in exchange for promises to grant territorial and trade concessions if his rebellion succeeded. These payments clearly demonstrated that his motivations were personal rather than patriotic, undermining the foundation of his defense. King Edward's handling of the trial had impressed even critics who had questioned his leadership abilities. His insistence on proper legal procedures, his restraint in allowing the defense to present their case fully, and his obvious commitment to justice rather than vengeance had strengthened his political position considerably. The young monarch had demonstrated the wisdom and fairness that many had doubted he possessed. The deliberations of the noble tribunal lasted 2 full days, during which the political future of the kingdom hung in the balance. The judges had to weigh not only the legal evidence but also the political implications of their decision. Too lenient a verdict could encourage future rebellions, while excessive punishment could create sympathy for Vance and resentment against royal authority. When the tribunal finally reconvened, the tension in the courtroom was overwhelming. Marcus could feel the weight of history as the chief judge prepared to announce the verdict that would either vindicate the king's actions or create new political crises for the monarchy. The verdict of guilty on all charges was delivered with the solemnity appropriate to such a momentous occasion. The evidence of treason and foreign conspiracy had been too overwhelming to dispute, and the tribunal's decision effectively validated the king's response to the crisis. However, the sentence proved more controversial than the verdict itself. Rather than ordering immediate execution, the tribunal sentenced Lord Vance to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years. This decision reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and his noble birth, which traditionally carried some protection against the ultimate penalty. The compromise sentence satisfied neither those who demanded maximum punishment nor those who sought clemency, but it avoided creating a martyr while ensuring that Vance could never again threaten royal authority. The completion of the trial marked the end of the immediate crisis, but it also began a new chapter in the kingdom's political development. King Edward had successfully defended his throne and established his authority, but the underlying challenges of governance remained to be addressed. The conspiracy had revealed genuine concerns about royal leadership that would need to be handled through reforms and improved governance rather than legal proceedings. Marcus reflected on the transformation he had witnessed in both the king and the kingdom during this crisis. The uncertain young monarch who had inherited the throne had been forged into a confident leader capable of decisive action when necessary. The political system had been tested by internal conspiracy and foreign interference, but had proven resilient enough to survive and adapt. The lessons learned during the crisis would influence the kingdom's approach to governance for generations to come. New security procedures had been implemented to detect and prevent future conspiracies, while political reforms had been designed to address legitimate concerns about consultation and representation without compromising royal authority. As the courtroom emptied and normal palace routines resumed, Marcus understood that his role as captain of the guard had permanently expanded beyond traditional security responsibilities. The complex challenges facing the kingdom required intelligence gathering, political analysis, and strategic planning that went far beyond simple protection of the royal family. The kingdom had survived its greatest internal challenge in generations, but the experience had changed both its institutions and its leadership in fundamental ways. The young King Edward III had proven himself capable of defending his throne and his realm, setting the stage for what many hoped would be a long and prosperous reign built on the foundation of justice, wisdom, and strength that had been demonstrated during the crisis. The ancient walls of Raven's Hollow Palace had witnessed another chapter in the long history of struggles between royal authority and noble ambition. This particular conflict had ended with the crown's victory, but it had also established new precedents and expectations that would shape the kingdom's political landscape for decades to come. The political intrigue that had threatened to destroy the monarchy had ultimately strengthened it, creating a more mature and resilient system of governance capable of meeting future challenges.